As we finish up Unit 1 and get heading into Unit 2, I want to take some time to revisit an idea that we introduced on our very first lesson, Lesson 1.1, as we talked about scarcity, and this idea that societies as a whole face this issue of scarcity when they look at their resources, right? The resources we have, capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor, those are scarce. And we have to determine what goods and services are we going to make with those resources in order to satisfy people's wants and needs. And we said that there was three questions that all societies have to ask themselves. But the way these questions are answered and how these questions are answered determine what we consider our economy. And so those three questions were, what will we produce with our scarce resources? How are we going to produce it? And for whom are we going to produce it? And like I said, every single society has to ask themselves these three questions. But really what we want to get down to today is who answers these questions and how do they do that? Because the who and the how gives us our economy. What economic system are we dealing with? And really what we can start by is just boiling it down to how much involvement does the government have in the economy? And so if we sort of had a little spectrum here, we would put, let's say, total control of the economy on one side and absolutely no control on the other side. So we're going to introduce kind of the two extremes to start off and then go from there. So some of you might be familiar with this total control idea. We sometimes refer to it as a command system, where all we're saying there is that the government decides the what, the how, and the for whom, that there's some central planning like agency that is determining, okay, how are we using these resources? What are we going to make? And once we make it, who's getting it? Sometimes we see this as referred to as socialism, maybe more specifically communism, wherever we see that the government owns the factors of production. They own the capital, the entrepreneurship, the land, and the labor. And maybe a simple way of saying this is that decisions are being made for the people rather than by the people, right? So the government is making those decisions for the people. The decisions are not being made by the people. Now, on the far extreme other end, we have what we refer to as laissez-faire capitalism. And you guys might be familiar with the term laissez-faire from U.S. history, as you talked about big business and kind of this, industrial revolution age, whenever the government was very, very limitedly involved in the government or in the economy at all. The government had next to no involvement, and these businesses were able to just kind of do whatever they needed to do. What we see in pure capitalism, as it's sometimes referred to as, is that the buyers and the sellers are the one determining what, how, and for whom the country produces. And some of you might be looking at that and you say like, okay, well, how do buyers like you and me determine what's going to be made, how it's being made, and who's getting it? Well, that's going to be the topic of our entire Unit 2 as we introduce supply and demand. But this is sometimes referred to as pure capitalism, where the people own all of the factors of production, and the only role that the government has is to protect people's property. Right? So the only reason that the government exists is to protect my private property, whether it's my labor, my land, whatever it might be. Another way of saying this is that the decisions then are being made by the people instead of for the people, right? So because the government's not involved, the people are the ones making the decisions, and the government is not making those decisions for them. Now, as we look at this, there are advantages and disadvantages to both, right? If we were to look at the two extremes. The advantages in a command system is that when you have central planning, any transition that you have to make, like if you have to shift resources in order to maybe mobilize for war or something like that, it can be done extremely easily and quickly. Maybe you remember the United States around World War II. Our economy, in a sense, shifted a lot toward command system as the government started telling people, hey, we need to start producing this or producing that. And the government was offering incentives to produce certain things because they knew if we just sat around and let the economy adjust to the war, it would take forever for our economy to mobilize for war. And also, command systems on paper promote equality, right? When we level the playing field and the government is deciding who gets what and everybody gets everything according to their needs. Now, laissez-faire capitalism also has its advantages as well. There's more freedom, right? Therefore, there's more consumer satisfaction. When you get to determine what you're getting and how much of it you're getting, you can best satisfy your desires and your wants and your needs. Also, there's private ownership of resources, right? Like you are your own person, you own your labor, you get to choose what you do with your labor rather than having the government tell you what to do. And the other thing is that capitalism adjusts gradually over time. And an easy way for us to see this is like with fashion trends, right? Nobody has to tell businesses, hey, whatever you're making is out of style. You need to start making the stuff that's in style. No, just gradually businesses shift as they respond to the desires of the buyers in the market, right? And that's true also on a big scale. A pure capitalist society, they adjust to the wants and needs of the economy, and it gradually happens over time. And there's always this kind of moving forward where sometimes we've seen historically one of the disadvantages of a command system is that they can fall behind. There's limited choice in a command system because you're being told, hey, this is what you get, this is how much you get, this is what's being made. But there's also not a lot of incentives for individuals to achieve higher, right? If we're leveling the playing field out here and the government is deciding what you get, how much, how much you are receiving, there's not a lot of incentive for you to try harder if you're not getting more out of it. People respond to incentives, and if there's no incentives to do better, people aren't going to respond. Now, on the flip side, we see that in capitalism, it can create inequality. This is a conversation that happens a lot in the United States as we talk about like the wealth gap that exists between the high of the high and the low of the low. And this is because that, whenever people have those individual freedoms and they have private ownership of resources, if somebody owns more resources than someone else, they can do more with it and make more money, right? Now, we often fall into this belief that the United States sits on the far right side of this line, that there's no control of the government, there's no government control within the economy at all, but that's actually not that true. And we'll probably see this today. Most economies today operate somewhere in the middle in something that's referred to as a market system, or a mixed market economy is another thing that it's referred to as. Sometimes it's just referred to as capitalism. Now, are we right smack dab in the middle like this shows? No, we probably are a little bit more toward the right side. However, what we need to see is that for the most part, in our system and a lot of systems across the world, buyers and sellers are the ones making the decisions. And specifically in the United States, the government does play a role. Like the government sets rules for economic activity. There are rules that exist. Like, for example, if I'm a business owner, I can't pay you less than minimum wage. That's a rule. Children can only work certain hours. Once you're young enough, you can't work at all. There's certain rules that exist for how we interact. There's regulations, talk about like the FDA. If you work in like a restaurant industry, all the guidelines that you're supposed to follow in order to conduct any sort of economic activity. It also promotes growth and stability. And we're saying the government does that. How does the government do that? Well, we just saw, back in 08, 09, in response to the Great Recession, that the government implemented a lot of policies to pump money into the economy. Or in response to COVID, we saw that the government was giving money to people and giving money to people in order to encourage them to go out and purchase stuff in order to stimulate the economy. The government was doing those things in order to promote the growth and stability of the economy. The government also exists to provide goods and services that otherwise might not be produced. We're going to get into this in Unit 3, but think about it. There are certain services especially that would go otherwise unproduced if it was not for the government. Goods as well. Like, who's going to make our roads, right? There's no incentive for a private business to go out and build and pave a road if they're not going to get money for it. And therefore, the government has to step in order to do that. And we also see that the government redistributes income. We see this through different government programs, whether it's unemployment, Social Security, and so much more. And so the government does play a pretty active role, not as active as, a strict command economy, but the government does have involvement. Now, some other characteristics we might see in market economies. We see private property, private ownership of resources, as we had mentioned before. Competition is a big thing, and competition is what helps spurn growth and moves us forward. And, think about it. What drives Apple to do better and be better? Well, they know that they're competing with Samsung. And so there's this constant back and forth of, hey, trying to be better to outdo the other, but we're actually seeing everybody is benefiting from that. There's the freedom of choice. You get to choose what you want, who you're interacting with. That ties in with this next one too. You get to choose who you're buying from, what you're buying, how much you're buying, and those types of things. Also, we see markets and prices. This idea that prices are set in response to how the market is feeling, how buyers are walking in and saying, hey, I want a lot of this today, or I don't want much of this today. It's something we refer to as supply and demand. And we can see that right now. I mean, there's a lot of things. If we just kind of like talk about the world today, there's a lot of things that people could get before, but now they can't, and because there's less of it available now, it's gotten more expensive, right? We see specialization as well because specialization helps promote productivity and growth. We mentioned that back in day 1.2. And then finally, we see an active but a limited government, right? Active but a limited government. So the government is involved, but they still are limited. Now, why do market economies rule? Like we see that there's these market economies or these mixed market economies exist all across the world, and a lot of major developed countries have some sort of mixed market system in place. Well, this will take us back to this guy by the name of Adam Smith, who was an economist back in the 1700s, and he famously wrote a book in 1776 known as The Wealth of Nations. And here's an excerpt from it. I don't want you to read it all, but I want to point your attention toward the bottom, where he introduced this idea. And it's this idea that we kind of refer to as that's pushing us forward, this idea of the invisible hand. He's talking about people and how they intend to they work, how they use their resources and all this stuff. And he says this idea of that it's almost as if people are led by an invisible hand to promote an end which at no part was their intention. And that bolded part is really important. By pursuing one's own interests, he or just someone in general actually promotes the interest of society as a whole more than they really intend to. And you're like, okay, well, what exactly does this mean? Well, let's think about it in terms of businesses. Businesses seek to further everything that's in their own self-interest. But let's think about this. Apple, right? When Apple comes out with a new phone, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to, make a new product that's going to sell a lot so that they can make more money, right? Or what's Apple doing when they lower their prices? Well, they're lowering their prices not so that you can have something cheaper. They're lowering their prices because they know they can sell more and make more money. So they're seeking out after their own self-interest. But Adam Smith said it's almost as if they're guided by this invisible hand promoting the public interest as a whole. Because competition and all that self-interest we're talking about there, it actually automatically and unintentionally furthers the best interests in society. And by them attempting to maximize their profits, they're helping society out as a whole. Like, let's think about this. Apple, they lower their price. Who are they lowering their price for? Well, they're doing it for themselves. Like, they want to have a lower price so they can outdo the competition so that they can sell more and make more money. But who's benefiting from that? Well, it's you and I. We're now getting cheaper phones, more affordable phones. At the same time, when Apple and Samsung compete, whenever they go back and forth and Apple comes out with a new phone with all these new features, who are they doing that for? Well, they're doing that for themselves. Because if they know that they make a better product, they can outsell Samsung, they can make more money. But who benefits from that? We do as well. And we benefit because we're now getting a better and more technologically advanced phone and at a cheaper price and all this stuff. And so we see that naturally we're seeing society as a whole is benefiting from this. And we'll see this more as we go along and talk about supply and demand and talk about markets then.